going to talk about slip, trip, and fall on properties. This is a very broad topic that has many permutations and different ways it can go. So the purpose of this is just to give a very broad overview of who is responsible when somebody falls on property, and the individual who fell, are they also responsible? So generally, property owners have an obligation, a duty, a responsibility to keep their property free and clear of hazardous conditions. If they fail to keep their property free and clear of hazardous conditions, and somebody falls as a result of that hazardous condition, then they are responsible for all of the damages that they've caused, less any culpable conduct, any responsibility that may be found by the person who fell. That's the broad overview with respect to responsibility. It's called duty. And if you want to learn more about duty, please look at the video where I talk generally about negligence law. But duty requires somebody to act as a reasonably prudent person would in similar circumstances. So a hazardous condition isn't enough to hold the property responsible because it requires something called notice. Now, depending on who the property owner is, defines what type of notice is necessary. A municipal property owner, meaning a city, a town, a governmental entity, often has their own special notice provisions because municipalities, towns, states, counties, cities have so much land that they're responsible for. They have built in basically where they are free and clear and not responsible to maintain their property free and clear of hazardous conditions unless they are on notice of the hazardous condition. Because these areas are so vast, unless the municipality is aware of the hazardous condition, then they're not responsible. And you may say, well, of course they're aware because they have police that drive by, they should have seen whatever it may be. Most municipalities have what is called a prior written notice statute. Says exactly what it is. The municipality is not deemed to be on notice of a hazardous condition unless they've received prior written notice of that hazardous condition. In addition to not only requiring prior written notice, many times they require, if somebody does fall, what's called a notice of claim. They must be put on notice of a potential claim within 90 days, 45 days, 30 days. Each municipality may be different, but they require advance notice. That's not starting of a lawsuit, but it's putting them on notice there may be a lawsuit. The reason for that is the same as because they're so vast and so many people may have potential claims, they get extra notice that a claim is coming so that they can quickly investigate it. Putting municipalities aside, and with respect to prior written notice, although I'll add one caveat, some municipalities have pushed off their obligation to maintain their properties to adjacent commercial property owners. So for example, and I can use New York City as an example, New York City has put the obligation to maintain sidewalks to be free and clear of hazardous conditions on the adjacent property owner if it is a commercial property owner. So for example, when one walks through Times Square on the sidewalk, every building adjacent to the sidewalk in Times Square is a commercial property owner. The commercial property owner has the obligation and duty, even though they don't own the sidewalk, the city imposed upon them the obligation to keep it free and clear of hazardous conditions. If in New York City there is no adjacent commercial property owner, If, for example, there's a park or it's an individual homeowner, a one or two family home, where there's no commercial activity going on. If there is a multi-use property, for example, there's a commercial property on the ground floor and then there are apartments above, that would be a commercial property. If there is solely a one family or two family home and there's no commercial activity going on, then the one and two family homeowner is not responsible for maintaining the sidewalk out in front of their property. Only when it's a commercial property that is adjacent to the sidewalk. And that's in New York City, and there are many cities throughout New York and other areas that have created that type of law. Moving away from municipalities and just general property owners, they do not require, and there is no law that says they have to have a prior written notice of a defective condition. So first, we have a duty, a responsibility. The fact that they own a piece of property imposes the duty and responsibility to keep it free and clear of hazardous conditions. The second is notice. Now, as I shared with municipalities, they require a prior written notice. There's no prior written notice that's required of property owners. So how do we prove notice? There's actually two ways. Actual notice, and how can we show actual notice? Actual notice is, depending on where the hazardous condition, and for my illustration, I'll use a pothole. If there's a pothole in the sidewalk right by the entrance to a property, and we know that the property owner has walked right over that pothole several times, that's actual notice. They had to have seen it. And during a deposition, and if you want to learn about depositions, there's another video with respect to that. But at a deposition, they have to admit that they were aware or saw it. If they don't, they will absolutely look silly. But actual notice comes in two forms, that they observed it or they created it. Oftentimes, property owners create the hazardous condition, and then we have proven notice. Another way of proving notice is what's called constructive notice. If there's a property owner who has a hazardous condition and they claim they were not aware of that problem, we can say, well, the property was in that condition for such a long period of time that you either knew, which you deny, or you should have known. Because with adequate and proper inspections, you would have seen the hazardous condition, you should have known about it, and that's really a question of fact for a jury as to whether or not they should have known about the hazardous condition. But that's called constructive notice. The third is a related to constructive notice, is that when there's a recurrent condition that happens over and over and over again, even if it is transient, that means it comes and goes, that if that condition recreated many times over a series of times, over a length of time, then it could be deemed constructive notice. Perfect example is a spout that comes out of a gutter. And if every time it rains, it runs over a sidewalk that a commercial property owner may be responsible for, and during the winter time that it melts and refreezes and then it forms a layer of ice, and it happens over and over and over again, just because it's not continuously there doesn't mean there is not constructive notice imposed upon the owner. Here too, that would be a question of fact for a jury. But ultimately, the property owner is responsible to maintain their property free and clear of hazardous conditions. And if it is deemed that the hazardous condition was the proximate cause, and the word proximate cause means related to the cause of the fall, then they would have responsibility for the injuries that flow from that hazardous condition. But also, and what is considered, is the person who fell. Why did they actually step into what would be a hazardous condition? Now, there's a thing called conspicuous and inconspicuous. Conspicuous are things that are open and obvious. And while they may be open and obvious after the fact, sometimes conspicuous, open and obvious conditions are inconspicuous before you're aware of it. A perfect example is a sidewalk that has the exact same coloration as a parking lot. And as one would be walking down a sidewalk, if there's no lines or demarcations that the end of the sidewalk is present and you would be stepping down a step, many people as they walk, because when people walk, nobody looks actually down when they're walking. You look out in the general vantage point of what you see, or you may be looking at signs or cars going by, but there's nothing to bring your attention to the fact that the sidewalk is ending, because it's like a mirage. It's at the end of the sidewalk and the coloration is identical to the parking lot. That would be an inconspicuous hazardous condition that becomes conspicuous and obvious after the fact. Well, a property owner has an obligation to give warning and give heed if people are likely to not see a defective condition. And how do we show such a condition? And how is it that we can show that the person who fell, it was inconspicuous to them? There are many experts, architects, there are building codes as to what's required, what's not required, but there is something that's called a human factors expert. A human factors expert generally studies in engineering and design, and studies what is it that goes through people's minds cognitively when they're engaged in certain activities. Because the human brain can only think about one activity at a time. We may jump very quickly, and that change in thought may be very quick, but you can't actually think about two different things at the same time. So if somebody's walking down a sidewalk and they're thinking about where they're going, or they're thinking about the cars that are on the road, and their subconscious has them walking at a normal gait, a normal speed as they walk down, they may not be thinking about the hazardous conditions. Why? Because of expectations. People expect to be warned when a hazardous condition comes upon them. We are accustomed and expect that if there's a hazardous condition like the end of a curb, when the coloration is the same, that there'll be yellow markings or some type of striping putting us on notice of that. So a human factors expert would come in and say that an individual walking down a sidewalk, thinking about multiple different things and not expecting a hazardous condition, it's absolutely reasonable and expected by the property owner that they would step off a curb without realizing that the curb existed, because there are no warning signs there. So when it comes to fall down cases, the duty and obligation on the owner, the way we handle it is there are three things the property owner must do. The first thing is, when there's a hazardous condition, the first thing you must do is fix it. If you can't fix it, and there are some times that you can't fix it, you must guard against it so that people aren't exposed to this hazardous condition. If you can't fix it and you cannot guard against it, the last thing you do, and it's the least advantageous, is you warn. And that's the story that I've been talking about. The person walking down a sidewalk, they can't fix the sidewalk from being the same color as the parking lot. They can't guard against it unless they said you can't walk on the sidewalk anymore. So the third and least likely alternative, but the one that would apply here, is warn. How do you warn? You warn by putting markings on the property and change the color with respect to the change in the height. So the core way that we show that property owners failed to live up to their obligation is that A, they had a hazardous condition on their property, that they failed to fix that hazardous condition, that not only did they fail to fix it, they failed to guard people from being exposed to that hazardous condition, and lastly, they failed to warn people that a hazardous condition existed. So that's a general overview with respect to property owners' responsibility and fall down cases.